So I've been throughout the series of this analysis of season one. I've been tracking the relationship between the three worlds in Twin Peaks. Just real quick, World One, the common everyday experience everyone has. World Two is the seedy underbelly, the drug ship, the drug smuggling, the secret societies, everyone's secrets, and then World Three, which is the spiritual world, the Black Lodge, and so forth. That just becomes in this episode becomes so much more fleshed out and pronounced. It's really interesting. I want to say something that I failed to mention in the previous episode, that there are some drop storylines, and that in an episode before that I said I would cover some of those things as we came across them, and I didn't in the previous one. And that is when they go to meet Leo Johnson. This is when Bobby and Mike meet Leo Johnson in the woods. They see a mystery man, and they say, "Who is that?" And he says, "Don't worry about it." I may have mentioned this. I apologize if I did, but I want to make sure I cover my bases here because it matters in the last episode of season one. And I'm only doing season one. So that mystery man is eventually a drop storyline, in my opinion. From what I can tell, it looks like a drop storyline. He gets split into two characters. The activities of that mystery man are split in two at some point. And I'll talk about that later when I come into it. But in this episode, we meet Bernard Renault. Now, Bernard Renault is Jacques Renault and Jean Renault's brother. Now, Jean Renault, we won't deal with, I think, until season two. But Jacques Renault, we meet this season. And for Jacques is the bartender at the Roadhouse, and Bernard is the janitor. Now, janitor at the Roadhouse should set up some red flags, because there's a famous scene in season 3 of Twin Peaks where it's just like 2 minutes of the janitor of the Roadhouse cleaning trash. It's such a terrible scene. But it's akin to the beginning of season 2 of Twin Peaks, where Agent Cooper is laying on the ground. He's been shot. And the old waiter is saying, "That milk's going to get cold on you." A lot of people get very frustrated with that scene. And I think Lynch likes to get a bunch of different emotions. And that scene's effective for getting frustration. And the scene in season 3 of Twin Peaks, where the guy's just cleaning up trash, I think could be referencing Bernard Renault. Now, many have said that Bernard Renault is the mystery man because he's involved in smuggling drugs from the Canadian border into Twin Peaks. That's a really good interpretation of who the mystery man is. And if you want to try to create consistency, that's not bad. It's not perfect, but it's not bad. I would still maintain it's just a dropped storyline. It's a character they never fleshed out. It was an idea that they just said, you know what, it added some complication that the story really didn't need anyway. But I would say if you have to say, okay, well, let's try to keep this as consistent as possible. Who is this mystery man that was hanging out with Leo? Bernard makes sense, I guess. But then you have to say at the end of season 1, who attacks Dr. Jacoby, because it's clearly the same mystery man. And who attacks Agent Cooper, because in season 2, Agent Cooper describes who shot him, and it is the mystery man. So there's a lot going on there. And some people have said it was Leland, but that doesn't make sense either, because we see Leland in episode 7, the final episode of season 1, and he's not dressed like the mystery man and he couldn't have been 2 places at once because of the attack on Jacoby. I'm sorry. Yeah. That's not right, because Jacoby was in the hospital room with him. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. You get the idea. But now I want to get to the meat and potatoes here. So this is the funeral. And at the funeral, Bobby says something really important. He says, "We all knew Laura was in trouble, and we didn't do anything. So you want to know who killed her? You did. We all did." What's he talking about? Well, he's talking about how the community has turned a blind eye to this dark world that Laura was wrapped up in. We all knew she was in trouble. She was just wrapped up in this dark world, and he said nobody was doing anything about it. In fact, some people there at the funeral were involved. He's hinting that everyone's turning a blind eye to this second world. I, at one time, lived in a house that was infested with roaches. It was disgusting, okay? It was the situation that we were in at the time, couldn't take care of the problem, okay? A lot of people hear that and think you were living in a place where people don't care about you and stuff like that. That wasn't the case at all. It's just a bad situation, and it was just a tough situation. I actually have a phobia of roaches because I would wake up and they'd be on me. It was terrible. And what I learned later in life is there are two types of roaches that are indigenous to the area I live in. There are spring roaches, which will come to the house for a period of time, but then they may only stay a week or two and then they leave. So if you see one of them, no big deal. But then there are other roaches that if you see one, you even see one, especially in daylight, your house is infested. Like overcrowded with roaches. And you're only seeing one and two here and there. And if you see one, that's why if I ever see one during the day, I pay very close attention. If I see any more, we're getting exterminator and taking care of it immediately. I would take out a loan to do something like that. Like, not going to have that problem. But when you see one and it scurries off, you move about your day and try to forget what you saw. Because you know all around you, under you, above you, everywhere is roaches. Went on a vacation to Florida one time, which is really a lot of roaches in Florida. And we were sitting in our hotel. It was like a hotel room. And I saw something fall from a vent that was in the ceiling. Middle of the day, and I saw it was a roach. And I was like, so crowded right above us that they got pushed out. They're all around us, you know, and you just tried to ignore it. You knew they were there, but you tried to ignore it. That's the first world of Twin Peaks. That's the first world. They're trying to ignore what's kind of bleeding out. Laura Palmer is bleeding out this second world into the first world. So the scene after that is some of the best dark humor, maybe the single best dark joke I've seen in a TV show, where Shelley is making fun of Leland for jumping into the casket. Now, by the way, at this point, the clues that Leland's the killer, like the abstract clues, are really good, man. He's, I've read, to be fair, I've read mixed reports on how much they knew. I think they knew Leland was the murderer, Lynch and Frost. They were the only two people that knew until they told Lynch's daughter so she could write the book between the two seasons. So they at least knew then, but they didn't know who Bob was exactly. They knew he was the killer, quote unquote, but they didn't know his involvement. And Lynch gave credit to some producer, I don't remember who it was, in season 2 when they had to solve the murder, that he was an inhabiting host, or you know, that he was inhabiting human beings. That is indicated, though, kind of in this episode. At the very end, Deputy Hawk talks about wandering spirits, and you see Leland. It was really good stuff, man. Anyway, so she makes a joke about him falling into the casket. Now, it's a joke, but it tells you something. They're not looking at this dark world, right? The second world. Maybe I'm reading a little too much into this, but it looks like they're making jokes about it. They're ignoring the second world. You know? And maybe that's what they had intended for Shelley to be making this joke. Maybe. We tend to make jokes about things we don't particularly care to really think hard about because they're disturbing. Who knows? Kind of interesting, man. Really interesting. So then we meet the Bookhouse Boys. Now, they're not called the Bookhouse Boys at this point. We're just told that for 20 years, so since 1970, it's been a group of people that have been there, and Truman says there's a kind of a strangeness in these old woods. So the Bookhouse boys have been very aware that there is a third world, but not everyone believes in this third world. To Truman, it's a myth. To Deputy Hawk, by the end of the episode, we learn that him and Cooper are on the same page. They believe in these wandering spirits. They believe that, there's something more sinister going on. Now, this is fleshed out in Mark Frost's books that he wrote right before the release of season 3, the first book in particular, where he goes into the Blackfoot tribe and all that. And it's not a great book, unfortunately, but it does flesh a lot of this idea out that there was something that the Native Americans were dealing with in the woods. It's probably the best part of the book. It's really interesting. I highly recommend it. If you love Twin Peaks, you have to read this book. But it is not a great read, but you learn a lot. Sorry, those sinuses are still killing me. So we're hearing about all of this at the diner. They're having this conversation. And so they go to the bookhouse, and there's Bernard. And so the bookhouse is dealing with the second world, and as it's dealing with the second world, but it was formulated because of they believe the second world exists due to the third world. And not everybody in the bookhouse believes that. They think, but they know something's wrong, and they want to do something about it. So they're observing all of this. This is one of the most important scenes in the entire series. Okay, I want to say one final thing. And the reason why, by the way, this series of scenes is because you just here's the town of Twin Peaks at the funeral. Here's the introduction of the Bookhouse Boys. And then at the very end is Cooper and Hawk talking about spirits, and there's hinting at this third world. Now, I want to do a quick rundown of what we know happened to Laura at this point, okay? Because of season 3, here's what we know. There's the third world is having some kind of civil war, a war between good and evil. It's manifesting itself in the person of Laura Palmer and in the person of Leland Palmer and in the spirit of Bob, right? Bob inhabits Leland. And so there's some type of spiritual conflict between the purpose of Laura's life and death in her confrontation with Bob through her father. All right. And that relationship caused her to go fully into the second world. And so she has a life of drugs, a life of prostitution. She's involved in One-Eyed Jacks. Deeply, and we learn in Fire Walk with Me that she's involved with a kind of a circuit of prostitutes with Teresa Banks, who is the woman that died before the series started, and it's the background character who's a now much more important character in Fire Walk with Me. But anyway, and then so that gets her involved with Jacques Renault and Leland Johnson. Not Leland, Leo Johnson in the second world. And then Bob knows that he ultimately cannot inhabit her. And so through her father kills her. And then in the confines of the second world. And that's what leads us to all of the events that are happening in season 1. Okay. So that's kind of the relationship from top to bottom and bottom to top there. Pretty interesting. And by the way, in season 3, I'll tell you, something happens that's just never going to happen in another show. And that is you see this played out more directly, and it's really interesting. And it's all happening in Las Vegas, where there's a hit put on Agent Cooper's doppelganger. And the people in the second world are just like, it's a hit. That's what they do. But they don't know that they're being directly influenced by the third world. And we're getting a God's eye view of this. It's like how the third world is directly impacting the second world. And the second world is sort of doing its bidding. It's so interesting. And where do these things converge? Well, oddly enough, they converge above a convenience store, right? And we learned that all throughout the series. And that's a big deal. The creepiest scene in Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me is I've been to one of their meetings, right? He says, I've been to one of their meetings, and they show above the convenience store. And then in season 3, we see the convenience store. And we learn the convenience store is a go-between between the third world and the second world. Whew, man, it's very deep. You could really mine this series for a long time and never get to the end. Man, I actually have really many more things I'd love to say, but unfortunately, there's just not any time for it. Hopefully, some more of this will get fleshed out as I move along in the series. And if you're watching this, I hope you're getting something out of it. Have a good one.